Jason, thanks for sitting down with us today and welcoming us into your home for this discussion.
My pleasure to have you here, Graham. Thanks for being here. Welcome to Austin, Texas.
Listen, you've published widely on trends and future outlooks. I mean, you were telling me that you published a paper with the Pentagon as the supply chain issues started to bite. How did you get here? What led you to this trends and future work?
It's kind of a long, windy road, as one might expect. It's not a teleological journey by any sense of the word. I studied history as an undergrad. I became an economist later, first professionally, worked as a consultant, was forecasting financial markets. And then my clients a number of years ago came to me and said, we really appreciate that you can model econometrically what's going to happen with financial markets and currencies, commodities and things. We need to know about what tail end events in a longer term could happen. And at that point, I really needed to develop a toolkit for planning and forecasting in unstructured environments. I founded the Futurist Institute, created an entire course of training, research, published books on this, because as I went through the process, I then created what I wished I had had at the beginning. And that's really helped me kind of build that out. And it's very exciting work, and it incorporates many different things from my previous careers. Yeah.
No, it's a fascinating area of work, and I think, when you talk about unstructured markets and disruptions, I mean, boy, we couldn't be in a more disrupted environment than we are right now. And yesterday you presented at the South by talking about 10 trends around transport and logistics. It was a fascinating talk, by the way. And of course, one of the key themes of this week at the South by has been technology. And I sat in a session with Mark Zuckerberg, the metaverse, and this was all pretty interesting. But what role is technology going to play in transport and logistics? This is a very material-based, asset-based industry. How do you see technology shaping supply chains and the transport logistics?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I remember yesterday in the talk at South by, and I appreciate y'all, but we're there for that. I did say, look, this is not the metaverse, right? Because we talk about technology, we think about the digital world, but at the end of the day, we all want real stuff. We all want physical things, and we saw that surging goods demand and tight supply chains in the wake of COVID and even now. And I think about how does the virtual world, how does technology play out? We see things like training for people in different jobs. You can use VR to make sure people know their jobs before they're actually physically on the spot. That's one area where you can see how does that metaverse play out. And we think of it as for a gaming and an exciting entertainment world. But there are these kind of relatively boring corporate use cases that have high value for all new technologies, right? We think about blockchain and people are super excited about crypto. Well, you know what it's really good for? It's really good for keeping track of where your goods are. And NFTs, wow, it's apes and people and the whole thing. And you can also use it for supply chain provenance. And so sometimes these things that become fads in technology, there's another use case that most people aren't thinking about that probably has real economic impact. Now, there are other areas where there's more clearly defined, clearly obvious areas of impact. We think about artificial intelligence. I think about the future of quantum computing, how that's going to help optimize supply chains, where there's increased stressors, increased demands, increased needs. I think about automation. And while people are like, look at that disco dancing robot, right, which is cool, and robots doing parkour and dog dancing robots on late night TV are super cute and whatnot. The truth is that there's already a ton of automation in supply chain, material handling, warehousing. Without that, we wouldn't be able to have e-commerce the way we do. And so we're going to see a lot of these automation technologies, data technologies, but even the virtual reality, even the biggest of sort of the hype locust dynamics around NFTs and blockchain, all of that's going to come to a supply chain near you.
Yeah. No, it's an exciting future for sure. But one of the things that, if you're running a supply chain, you need is certainly visibility and certainly optimization, but you still need to move stuff. At the end of the day, it's physical. So is this then more about merging the physical with the meta, as you might say? Or how do you see that? Because at the end of the day, you still have to move stuff.
I mean, I see it as sort of a bifurcated situation, right? There's the metaverse, and there are uses for the metaverse, like for training, right? There are different things that can be done. We think about self-driving cars. Rather than having them on roads, you can kind of bootstrap the number of miles if you create a virtual world where the technology, because look, the operating system of a self-driving car doesn't know it's on an actual road. It doesn't care if it's on an actual road or operating in a digital world, right? So there's ways you can bootstrap that kind of automated technology. But in terms of moving stuff around, I think provenance is important. I think about energy efficiency, something that came up in our talk around sustainability and climate change, because even if we move to a world of, let's say, regionalized or localized 3D printing operation facilities, which become like the modern blacksmith. Whatever you need, you go there and they make it for you. Well, that's really great, but they're probably not making it out of thin air, which means you still need aluminum and copper and plastics and resins and all these other things to be there. Well, that stuff still needs to show up. You still need to move those things. Making sure people know that there's a physical supply chain where things are physically moving. I think that's really important. That's not the metaverse, but if they want the VR headsets, they want the computers, they want the chips, and they want the couch they're sitting on and the food they're snacking on, we don't have replicators. This is not Star Trek. So supply chains are going to be really critical. Even if we had a fully 3D printing world, you're still going to need a lot of stuff moving around.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me coming into this industry is how antiquated it was 14 years ago in terms of how communications are done, how the clearance system works. And when you talk about quantum computing optimization, I mean, part of the challenge, of course, has been many actors, many moving parts. You just simply don't have the computing capabilities to make this optimized. So can you speak a bit more about where quantum could take us in terms of being able to optimize complex networks and keep those dynamics in check?
Sure. And I think it's really interesting you say that 14 years ago it was antiquated, because I think about doing MBA courses almost 20 years ago, and supply chain were words that were barely uttered. And even in more recent years, supply chain isn't something people talked about. But once COVID hit, every granny and little child was talking to you about their supply chain problems, right? And everyone now has this, the fact that supply chain has become a zeitgeisty idea, and that there's this broader awareness of it is very, very interesting to me as someone who's been involved in supply chain industries for many, many years. And I think the technology and the applicability to generate ROI and improve efficiency and optimization. All of those things are really exciting to me. And for quantum computing, you're talking about probabilistic, non-deterministic calculations that will be done as quantum computing reaches scale. So in other words, a non-probabilistic, deterministic calculation would be, think of an Excel spreadsheet, 3 plus 3, right? Gets you 6. That's very deterministic, it's not probabilistic. Now, if we have a massive amount of data around a certain number of goods that need to go to a certain number of places, and we plug them in to a quantum computer, in theory, what happens is, and we know this happens, but at scale, we would, in theory, over time, be able to apply this to supply chain, where the least optimized solutions of ways to deliver all those different goods, transfer all those goods, would be eliminated, and what you'd be left with is the non-deterministic, probabilistic best answer. Now, is that the right answer? Well, no, but you're dealing with such a really wild set of data and so much data, it would be a very different way to computationally get there.
Yeah. I remember doing operational research and linear programming at university, and it's just taking it to that third dimension, which is the goal that we'd always been seeking, right? I mean, it just opens up so many possibilities. I think that's really exciting, I think.
That's right.
Both from an efficiency perspective, and then you think also from miles traveled and the sort of environmental perspective, sort of huge potentials there. Just switching a bit, I mean, technology is also, apart from impacting the supply chain, how we run things, is impacting the customer, the consumer, how they have interacted with the buying experience, e-commerce being, of course, the main go-to tool during the pandemic. What's going on the consumer side in terms of the use of tech? Where do you see this going, and how do you see it impacting on supply chains, particularly last mile and so on, where demand has increased significantly, let's say?
Yeah, so consumers are not very tolerant of things not working right. They have very high expectations. So if you expect something will be delivered on a certain day, it needs to be there. We know that now. Apply that to future technologies. So the first time flying drones deliver me something here in Austin, Texas, I'm going to be like, wow, here comes my flying drone. That's so cool. The second time, I'm going to be like, why is it 30 seconds late? So, this is how consumers are going to approach this. They get used to a technology, they get accustomed to it. Like if you took e-commerce away today, there might be, people might lose their minds, right? Like it would be something that people are very, very unhappy about. They're, hooked on the sauce, and they'll get hooked on whatever technology makes their lives more convenient. And so for last mile, this is really where satisfying that and fulfilling that promise of e-commerce. We can get you stuff, we'll get it cheaply, we'll get it fast, it'll be there pretty much as soon as you need it, it's gonna be on time. All of those promises are fulfilled because there's so much technology on the back end. As the amount of e-commerce continues to rise, and as we see in markets where e-commerce is not broadly used, it will be adopted. We're going to see more and more stressors on the system. And thinking about that efficiency, optimization, all of that in terms of operational limitations, but also thinking about the operational efficiency in terms of fuel consumption are going to be really important to try to not only meet the needs of, we want to keep our customers happy, and yet they have even more demands, and they want even more stuff, and yet we need to do it with a smaller CO2 footprint. So all of those things become moving pieces that really require an integrated understanding of the technologies available and what the design thinking parameters are. What does the customer want, and what do they expect? Yeah. The question around returns is a really good one, and I think a lot of businesses have probably built very successful models based on the fact that people want to return things but never get around to it. We've seen similar things historically around rebates, right? Oh, buy this, there's a huge rebate, and more than 50% never redeem it, right? So there's a lot of science around this that sometimes people don't want something but they just can't be bothered to return it. In terms of when you do want to return things, there are often many ways to do this, right? You can bring it to a store, you can put it in the mail, you put it with one of the other parcel shippers, people can pick it up at your house. Different companies offer different things, and since they're delivering stuff all the time everywhere anyway, if they're already on the road, whether they're dropping something off at your house or picking it up, as long as it's integrated into their sort of daily plan and whatever the last mile transport is, it's less critical an issue, I think. It would only be a really critical issue if you had a market where you didn't have a high density population, you didn't have a lot of e-commerce, and you had a disproportionately high number of returns. So I think that those three things seem very difficult to get to, especially since post offices exist, right, in every little village and town everywhere. Most returns can happen that way. If you don't bring it to the post office in time, the company's all the happier. So I guess that's how I approach that question.
So I mean, from discussing this from the tech side, right, from the sort of complexities of managing supply chain down to now, the last mile and the demands of the customer, supply chains are becoming more intricate. They're becoming more. There's more dependencies in the system. Mm-hmm. Yet at the same time, we're seeing a lot more disruption coming from big events around the world, but also micro events. And so this has led to this theme of resilience in supply chains. How does that look? You look 5, 10, 15 years out, or even in the immediate situation we're in with issues in China and of course in Europe. How should companies be thinking then about being able to run these supply chains given all of the dependencies and given the increasing number of disruptions they're seeing in the marketplace?
It's a very difficult question, and there are a few answers. Unfortunately, none of those answers are cheap, and many of them at cost. We think about the importance of not having a sole source vendor for a product, right? Making sure that you have multiple potential vendors. And maybe one is the cheapest and one is the best, but if you source everything from that one vendor and everyone sources everything from that one vendor, if something goes wrong, suddenly your supply chain breaks, you no longer have a business. I think about redundancies, not just there, but also within the supply chain. If you have localized issues, this is the reason maybe you want to have more than just enough trucks to transport and just enough vans and just enough, right? Which brings me to the bigger overarching theme, which is for decades, the trend in supply chain has been to just in time. Everything should be just in time. You need just enough to get by and everything will be fine. And maybe that worked fine up until COVID, but as we see disruptions and other risks becoming more fractal, there have been other different disruptions we've seen in recent years, but I think this is one where we've seen many companies suddenly approaching the challenge, going maybe away from just in time and moving to just in case. Does that reduce your profit margin? Yes. Does that increase your OPEX? Yes. Does having extra inventory, extra trucks, extra vendors that don't add value and add cost, is that good for your bottom line? Not directly, but it's a kind of insurance. And as we all know, when you buy insurance, that's not something that adds to your bottom line, right? That's an expense. But you certainly want to have it when things go wrong. And so having those redundancies, having that just in case, that's something that people have been pushing for in the last year and a half, especially in supply chains. There was a big contention between just in time and just in case. And I think in 2022, the folks who were pushing for just in case in 2021 seem somewhat vindicated right now.
Yeah. But as you say, it's a costly exercise. And I mean, if you look at some of the numbers on, cost of warehousing, once you take into account, insurance costs and so on and so forth, redundancies and so on. I mean, you're looking at for some products up to 50% of cost of goods sold. So there's a balancing act here, and I think there's going to be a continuum. But as you said, if you don't have the product, you miss the sale. And in this day of e-commerce, then you lose a customer. Potentially. So I think that calculus seems to be changing for sure. So there's very clearly, some of the disruptive events we've talked about during COVID, where you simply couldn't get product. Yep. Today we're facing other and ongoing issues. What should companies be thinking about in terms of potential disruptions that are coming at them over the next sort of few years, and then some of these trends will continue out over the next 5 or 10. What's sort of top of mind for you that companies should be thinking about and planning about to make their supply chains resilient?
I think just in case is the way to go. Every year the Futurist Institute produces something called the Robot and Automation Almanac. It's a collection of about 24 different essays from executives in different fields about automation and AI and robotics. We always have folks who contribute from supply chain. Jim Rice from the MIT CTL program contributed to this year's almanac. And there were other supply chain professionals, executives who did as well. And in those essays this year, and in my essay as well, there was a discussion around just in case. And at the end of the day, if you don't have the goods, you don't make the sale, you might lose the customer. Going forward, that imperative will not go away. And I think even about consumers, I think about toilet paper shortages that happened in 2020. And I can imagine easily someday my grandchildren or someone else's grandchildren coming up to me and asking me why I have a large pantry, why I have a closet full of toilet paper. And it's going to be, well, I lived through the COVID, right? Now, does having that extra toilet paper, extra food, extra stuff around, is that a good use of my funds? If I don't want to run out of it, it is, right? And so this is, even consumers are making this decision. Even home builders are now putting pantries in homes. Something that, even though, right, e-commerce stuff can get here quickly. Yeah, but the e-commerce, it has to be in the warehouse in order for it to get to your house in the first place. So you're seeing these decisions being made even at the retail consumer level, going all the way up. And in a call I had earlier today about some risks that are continuing to go fractal with a manufacturer, or a series of manufacturers, my recommendation really was to remember, you don't own the goods until they're in your warehouse. And if you don't have them, you do not have them. No matter what your hedging strategy is for supply, no matter how secure you feel in it, you don't have it unless you actually do.
Yeah. And that's an interesting point. So, I mean, given that supply chain is becoming sort of really core and become visibly core to the value proposition, what are you hearing and seeing from those who rely on those supply chains? Are they thinking, hey, we need to take control of this and bring it in-house? Or is it more, take the other extreme, no, we need professionals and we need to have a much more different set of products offerings from those logistics companies in order to make our supply chains resilient, in order to make them integrated and efficient? And what's the kind of sense you're getting from those that you talk to, or is it too early to make that call?
A lot of the companies I talk to have supply chain professionals, and many of the businesses, we do a lot of work with MHI, which is the material handling industry in the United States. That's a supply chain business, right? And those companies are struggling with these. Well, if you're in a supply chain industry and you're struggling with supply chain issues, what does that mean for everyone else, right? So, and that's like the heart and core of it. So every industry is struggling with these issues, and many of them have had very little visibility of supply chain up until recently. What this means, I do think, is the easiest answer is buy it all, buy it now, let's stock up. And is that an elegant answer? No. Could that exacerbate the bullwhip effect? Yes. Is it a brute force answer that for people without, deep skill in the space is easy to implement? Yes. Just stock up our warehouse, and you know what? Worst case scenario, as long as we have non-perishable goods, we're going to have some inventory on our balance sheet for a while, but our customers will be happy. And we think about vendor scorecards, something that in procurement supply chain has been very important for evaluating, right? How reliable is your vendor? Oftentimes, there are lowest cost vendors, but that's not who sometimes companies choose from a procurement strategy standpoint. You want the most reliable vendor, and you're willing to pay a premium for reliability. Well, if you're willing to pay a premium, if people are going to pay you a premium, you know what? We can afford to have more inventory because people know we will always have it here. And we're going to see some of that. I think we're also going to see manufacturing change and regionalization, localization, globalization of some of the manufacturing. I suspect we'll see, looking forward 5-10 years from now, a lot more manufacturing in the United States. We'll probably see a lot more manufacturing in the European Union. You're going to see and a lot of that will probably be automated, but we're going to see a lot more manufacturing in those places to reduce this risk, to shorten some of the supply chains.
Right. So we've talked about tech and how that's impacting. The other sort of vector or dimension here is regulation, what policymakers are doing, and it goes also to your last point around nearshoring, and there seems to be an increased appetite to tilt the playing field, or some would say level the playing field, to encourage some of that reshoring. One of the things you touched on yesterday was around provenance of parts and understanding where down into tier 3 suppliers your parts are coming from. Can you speak to that a little bit about what regulators are looking for there, particularly in the current context of sanctions and so on, becomes even more pressing, I think. But then maybe also more broadly about what you're hearing from policymakers around their attitudes to sort of global trade and the level playing field.
Sure. As we sit here, and the opening salvos of Cold War II have started, I suspect going forward you will see trading blocks emerge, and not too dissimilar from what we saw in the first Cold War. That being said, even for many years, if you wanted to do work with the U.S. Department of Defense, for example, there's a list of goods you cannot be using in that work. And going forward, I have been expecting, following especially the tariffs in the U.S., that were implemented under the Trump administration, the Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, and the Section 301 tariffs on various goods, especially high-tech goods, those were carried forward and have remained in place under the Biden administration, which means this is a bipartisan concern, right? Those are two very different administrations, and they're both holding firm on this point. I think we will see more types of regulation around where things come from and an expansion of which governments require things to be from certain countries, or rather a list of countries from which you cannot be using certain parts, certain components. That will go from what had been at the DoD and the federal level down to state governments, local governments, all of those requirements. We could see that also in Europe expand as well. So depending on what happens as Cold War II moves forward, we are likely to see these dynamics evolve further. This makes provenance really important, because if you're doing any work with a national, state, local government, you might need to demonstrate that, yes, indeed, those microchips, that hard drive, those laptops, those video cameras did not come from country X, Y, or Z. How are you going to do that? This is where something like blockchain and NFTs could become very important. A company that I founded with a JV partner called the co-founded entity is called NFT Degree, and the idea is to create NFTs that secure the provenance of academic degrees, because it's something that you could easily replicate, right? If I took my college diplomas, I can bring them down and reprint a copy. But if I had an NFT that was issued by the university on my degree, you wouldn't be able to duplicate that and the app and confirm it.
And so the idea would be with parts that you would be able to authenticate that this part came from this company, from this location,
That's right,
with these inputs.
That's right. So our JV partner is called iTrace, and this is what they do. They create for physical parts, think aircraft parts, think high-tech parts, think luxury goods. They put NFTs onto these goods, and they are scanned in by their own proprietary app on their controlled blockchain, and then as it moves through the system, you now can see where it's been used and where it's from. For something like aircraft parts, this is especially important because they might have a useful life of, say, 20 years. And you certainly want to know what planes was it on, when was it serviced, what airlines had it, where was it made, when was it made, right? All those things can be recorded on permanent corporate blockchains. Again, we're not talking about recording it to Ethereum. We're not talking about selling these like artwork. We're talking about creating a unique marker that is controlled and created by a specific entity and monitored by their controlled blockchain so that you can verify its provenance. So that's very different, but it's exactly to your point. You want to be able to know where, when, how, the whole everything of it in a permanent and easily verifiable way. And so in the same way we're doing that with intellectual capital assets, right? Physical assets, that's going to become a conditio sine qua non going forward as we see these Cold War II risks continuing to evolve.
And presumably, if we think also in terms of the greening of not just supply chains, but our general economy in terms of reuse and recycling of parts, this is also potentially a huge enabler for being able to track and trace, know the quality of the part, understand its history, and then refurbish and recycle, presumably.
Absolutely, and there could even be inputs around what the CO2 content is. So as we think about some countries that are more focused on CO2 and others that are not, if you're inputting goods from a country and it is some way marked so that you can confirm its provenance, you may want to levy a tariff on those goods, for example, that come from a place where CO2 is not a priority. And by doing so, that tax might incentivize either greener behaviors at home or provide the finances from the tariff revenue to increase competitiveness for goods and allow those funds to do any number of things, either subsidize more greening at home or be as a rebate to consumers who might be paying more because there's an offset in place that's captured by that tariff. These are things that right now have been in discussion, are in the works. Whether they come to fruition or not in the United States, I don't know, but but this is something that's been out there as a discussion point to make things a more level playing field in terms of thinking about CO2 and sustainability.
Yeah. So it seems that, I mean, there's quite a few forces here, right, to where we started, that these are not linear. This is not just about economics in terms of driving efficiency anymore. There are policy layers, there are technology layers. Yeah. And on the technology side, we've had these push and pull factors. And one of the sort of pull factors is, in my head, is around automation and 3D printing, making it more possible on a commercial basis to produce stuff closer to the consumer. So you think about, the reason the supply chains went to Southeast Asia principally was because of the labor cost arbitrage. You could produce things more cheaply. As you're beginning to increase automation, does that change the equation? And does 3D printing, does that begin to change the equation around the pure sort of economics and commerciality of where you produce stuff?
Let me disaggregate the two kind of topics here. And so the first is, as we think about the use of automation, and then we think about the use of 3D printing, automation's coming everywhere, right? And if we think about China, the world's factory floor, there are a lot more robots there than there are in almost any other country. I think they have the most robots, right, in manufacturing out of anywhere in the world. And they're adding lots of robots. So to think that we would build factories that don't have robots, is probably not where we would go. We would build factories with robots. What does that do to the calculus of it all? I think there are other parts at play and not just automation. I think the tariff situation, I think trade relations, all of these things. For 3D printing, I think this is still relatively niche uses. Does it reach commercial scale? Does it replace factories? Do we replace entire parts? Over time, maybe. I feel like this is more a maybe someday situation rather than an almost now. And I tend to divide the future into two time frames, the almost now and the maybe someday. The automation is here, not just in the almost now, but in the now. And we think about factories and supply chains, and automation is across all of those. We're beginning to see more retail robots now, but in the supply chain and manufacturing, they are very present. In terms of 3D printing, I think that's still going to be a little ways out at scale.
Yeah, yeah. You also talked yesterday around you could say the land side, and I'm really thinking now about the greening of logistics. Of course, a huge challenge, and certainly something that Maersk is at the forefront of. Leading on the ocean side. The land side is important as well, of course. That's also challenging. I mean, you talked yesterday about batteries and electric vehicles and some of the constraints there. What do you see? What are the roadblocks to really scaling up on the electric vehicle side or alternative fuel side on the vehicle and sort of land side of the supply chain?
Yeah, the biggest challenges to electric vehicles and batteries are the limitation of the materials that go into the batteries. Everyone wants a green planet. Everyone would love to see net zero CO2 emissions. Based on research we've done, based on data from the IMF, there's just not enough of the basic materials to get there. And we think about supply chain problems. If you don't have enough lithium and cobalt, your supply chain isn't just across an ocean, right? The only way you get new lithium and cobalt is dead stars. So if that's now your supply chain source for your battery materials, you have a serious problem. So more mining might help us find what's here. But if we don't have the materials on the planet, we're not going to be able to probably get to all the batteries everyone wants, at least not in that time frame. Now we're talking off-planet mining. This is all very complicated, very expensive. This is a much further out sort of problem. But the big underscore thing is we all want electric vehicles, lots of electric batteries everywhere. That's the expectation of the general public, especially in Europe. We're gonna have electric vehicles everywhere. There just might not be enough of the batteries to do that, which means, I suspect, commercial vehicles become the main target for these batteries. Even if we think about waterborne transport, it's very difficult in the current situation to imagine that because of limited ranges and how are you charging them and this sort of thing. But one of the main sources of some of the emissions around freight is often tugboats that are assisting boats coming in and getting out of harbors. Well, those could go electric, those could be charged. So maybe within the supply chain we have to think about flexibility-wise, where can we get to commercial grade application of electric vehicles? Because using, like me having an electric car, I don't have an electric car. It doesn't make a lot of sense. My car sits in the driveway in the garage 97+% of the time. And for most people, it's 95% plus, right? There's no need. That's actually a waste of the battery in that sense. But having every delivery van, having every heavy-duty truck, having every tugboat have an electric battery. Oh, that makes a lot of sense from a CO2 emission standpoint, from a utilization standpoint. That's where you have your impact. And I think that's what we will see. But for some forms of transport, it might require something else. It might take longer to get to the different technologies that will make everything what we want it to be.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting. This tiering of markets that we're going to see for some of these key technologies. No, that's something to certainly think about. And when you think about the cost and pricing, of course, there will be consequences of having to ration the technology, essentially.
Right, and if we think about like on-road trucks, you know, they're on the road almost all day. They're putting out a lot more CO2 than when, like, you know, I drive somewhere. I'm not driving many places. So we certainly would want those vehicles to have electric batteries right away, right? And buses and other forms of transport, they're transporting lots of people. So I think we're going to see not necessarily a mandated or regulated rationing, but just from an economic use case, the batteries get more expensive, and then suddenly the market figures out, oh, who can really get the best ROI of electric? Oh yeah, it's a commercial vehicle that's on the road all the time.
And this is one of those tricky areas where you need those market signals to do exactly that. At the same time, there's a role for government and public policy to catalyze and to think about the infrastructure side. So it's a really careful balancing act that has to be struck in order not to kill off the market signals.
Well, that's right. And of course, there's also the other piece, which is a lot of the electric battery tech that we've seen and the advancements of the last decade have been driven by retail demand. Yeah. So the interesting part is, right, the whiz bang of, you know, whatever we see on TV or thinking electric, individual retail consumers thinking electric is cool, or even if it's virtue signaling, like I want to just say I have an electric car, doesn't matter. That's driving the tech. And so it's really strange, right? Because the demand signal's coming from the retail consumers who are actually not the most efficient market from a CO2 standpoint, but that's what's driving the technology and the development. So, you know, I think we're going to see this balancing act going forward. But if CO2 really becomes a probability, the priority in a low supply environment, then we are going to see the commercial ROI become even more stressed.
So, Jason, we've spoken around technology and policy and how those two together are sort of reshaping supply chains, both at the consumer level, then obviously also at the supply chain operator level. One of the themes that I've been really struck by here in the last week of South by is the S and the G out of ESG, and then the focus on DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, spoken to by all sessions, all companies. How is that reshaping companies' purpose and how they need to reshape their thinking to be part of the communities and be responsible towards the communities they operate in?
The imperative really comes much like with some of the battery tech. The real push is coming at the grassroots level, that there are a real desire to see companies behave in a way that investors are proud of. And this means doing many different things right. And, you know, that means being a good corporate citizen, right? Being cognizant of what the environmental impact of what you do is, being cognizant of the social impact, being cognizant of being inclusive of the people who are your customers and your vendors and the people who live in our communities, and making sure that all of that, you know, that's what we want done right, and that's what companies are trying to do. And just like with the retail interest, right, this is grassroots, but there's also big money behind this. Institutional investors want to see this happen. And so when you get that pairing of the grassroots interest in doing something and doing something right, whether we're talking about trying to focus on sustainability from an environmental standpoint, or trying to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, doing something right when you have that retail social push at the individual level, and then you also have the big money push on the institutional side, things get done. And you also have things that throughout the system then can support these, because if you have retail consumers and institutionals pushing for it, then you have things like rating agencies evaluating. You have audits evaluating things, right? You can't improve something if you don't measure it. So now you have an entire culture around measuring better. What is our CO2 footprint? What are we doing that's sustainable? And one thing we haven't talked about was recycling, which for batteries will be especially important because of the limited amount of things, right? What are we doing in terms of our CO2 footprint, in terms of our recycling, in terms of our efficiency of operations? How are we doing that? And then thinking about audits around that, and thinking also around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like, what are we doing around that? Measuring that, and then trying to work from there. And I think that's the environmental and the sustainability piece is a little bit further ahead than diversity, equity, inclusion in terms of measuring things and setting goals and moving forward. But companies are trying to move very quickly on this because it is not just a social priority and not just an individual interest. It's something that also we're finding at the institutional level. There is a mandate to do the right thing regarding all of this, right? Sustainability, diversity, equity, inclusion.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And then one of the, so if you think about it from the sort of business side of things, how can you design products if you're not having representation on your board?
Well, there's some of that, and I think there's also, more importantly perhaps, how can you use a product or consumer product if you don't feel like that company is not doing what you view as the right thing, and is not being a good citizen, as if we've sort of anthropomorphized companies in this way, but we want to see that their corporate behavior in different ways is right. And for some companies, it might be numbers of board seats or who's on different seats and who has different roles. But there are many other ways that these things are right. Like, I think about pay gaps. I think about recruiting. I think about being involved in communities. I think about nonprofit activities that are often fostered at the corporate level. So there are many different ways that companies can be involved and do the right thing when it comes to sustainability and diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think sustainability, for example, the way European companies look at it, the way European companies think about CO2, or even the verbiage. In Europe, it tends to be more focused on the verbiage around climate change. In the US, it tends to be focused more on sustainability. But whatever the imperative, however the verbiage is packaged, the idea is the same. We must do better in these different ways that we act as individuals and as companies.
Yeah. Jason, thanks. It's been a fascinating talk. I just want to round this out by asking you, if you're a CEO today of a company embedded in supply chains, what are the three things that you would be kind of losing sleep about, planning for, and as you look over sort of a longer term horizon? You mentioned moving from just in case, just in time to just in case. What else should companies be thinking about and planning for?
I think right now my top priority would be concern about Cold War II and the risk of what would happen if we would see countries applying third-party sanctions in the wake of the Russian war on Ukraine. If we were to see third-party sanctions applied to, say, China, the economic risk around that is exceptionally high. So I'd be looking at kind of big stuff like that, and knowing also that Cold War II didn't really start here, that there are other things that have been building up to this. So I think that's probably the first thing. The second thing right now that's really critical is the war on the war for talent. That right now you're seeing Companies are fighting for highly skilled people. Demographics in every country in the world have slowing birth rates. Because of COVID, birth rates have slowed even faster than people were forecasting. There's a COVID baby bust. And so with aging populations and slowing birth rates, how do we have enough people to get everything done we want? How do we get the productivity? How do we fit automation into a super tight labor market in order to make sure businesses can meet their goals, can achieve what they want to? Because labor market's super tight and it might get even tighter, right? People talk about the gray wave became a gray tsunami during the COVID period. Well, as we look forward, making sure that automation helps to augment and supplement the people in your company as a way to scale, just like every other kind of technology has helped, right? Everything from software that requires most people, I know I don't have an executive assistant, I don't need one, right? Like I have email and I have PowerPoint and I can do most of my own things. And for many people, that was a big scaling factor. Looking forward to both hardware and software that allows scaling is going to be really important. And then as the third piece, I would probably recommend thinking about just-in-case inventories as a buffer against risk and as a kind of insurance. It's a cost of doing business, but it keeps you in business. And so that's it. Cold War II, global conflict stuff, automation fitting in and really trying to win the war on talent with an augmented workforce and planning for more technology as a lever, and then thinking about also having a little bit more inventory of everything around just in case, because the world's supply chains are not going to get a lot looser over time.
Jason, thank you so much for your breadth of insight here, but then also bringing it down to something very practical that we and our customers and companies can really sort of take action on. Thank you for your time. It's been a
Thank you, Graham. My pleasure. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.